Hello and welcome to the Carolina Journal's The Debrief. I'm your host today, Jeff Moore, Deputy Editor of the Carolina Journal, and joining me today we have Senior Political Analyst from the John Locke Foundation, Mitch Kokai, and we've got reporters from Carolina Journal, Brianna Kramer and Teresa Opeka. Joining us today. We've got a lot to talk about coming off of the highs of the election week last week, but it doesn't seem like we've slowed down quite as much as we usually do. There's still lots of news to talk about. We've got some great stories. One related to the election with the Libertarians playing spoiler in several statewide races and otherwise across the state. FEMA back in the news due to some controversy over whether or not they're discriminating against certain political associations. And we've got some news on Josh Dobson, the former labor commissioner for the state of North Carolina who resigned last week. We've got some news on what his next move is going to be. And then we've got a couple of court cases that we're looking at that Mitch will help us out with there. But first we want to go to this Libertarian story. Brianna, you had this story on CarolinaJournal.com. And we've got several races across North Carolina where it looks like Libertarians really did play an influential role in how that race was decided.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting to look at last week's election and see the Libertarian candidate in some of these high-profile races, the lieutenant governor's race, for example. The Democrat, Rachel Hunt, she won with 96,000 votes, and the Libertarian candidate got more than that, actually, 103,000. So the Libertarian candidate in some of these races really played a substantial part in maybe altering the outcome, maybe not. We look at some of the closer races or smaller races at the General Assembly, and they definitely did play a part in impacting if the Republican or the Democrat candidate got re-election, and ultimately that supermajority, they impacted that as well.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about third-party candidates maybe affecting these races in this election cycle, but we were talking about some different third parties just a few months ago with RFK Jr. and Cornel West, but it is the more traditional third party that actually has the bigger influence in these races. Mitch, what do you make of this influence they had in the election?
There definitely is an influence. We also have to be careful about saying that, oh, you know, if all those Libertarian votes went to the Republican would have won. Libertarians have often said, look, you know, you don't calculate it that way because, one, Libertarians take votes away from both of the major parties at times. There are some people who are left-leaning Libertarians who might be inclined to go to the Democrats, but they'll go to Libertarian. There are some right-leaning Libertarians who might go for a Republican. There are also Libertarians who are going to vote Libertarian, and if there's no Libertarian, they just don't vote for it. So I think probably if you looked at all of those Libertarian votes, some of them would have been people who would have said no Libertarian, I'll vote for the Republican. Some would have said no Libertarian, and I'll go with the Democrat. And some just would not have cast a ballot. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. But certainly it does play a role. And if there were enough of those Republican-leaning Libertarians who would have voted Republican, and that difference would have helped put that Republican over the top, then it could make a difference. I think that's one reason why Brianna's story pointed out that people from both of the major parties were now interested in talking to the Libertarians about ways that they can work together.
Yeah. And to Mitch's point, the leader of the Libertarian Party here mentioned that their principles weren't for sale, I believe that he said, but he was willing to work with the parties to see how they may be able to accomplish some of the goals that the Libertarian Party has. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I was able to speak with an official at the Libertarian Party, and the one race he pointed to that's very interesting, was very close, is House District 32 with Frank Sossaman. He was the Republican incumbent, and he lost by 132 votes. But the Libertarian candidate in that race received over 1,000 votes. So, you know, a lot more votes that could have gone to that Republican, you know, so that's the main one where maybe the Libertarian really did play an impact in giving that win to Democrats and ultimately taking away that supermajority. And so that's the one Libertarians are pointing to and saying, well, you know, we were fed up with some things and we weren't happy about some things, so we're putting candidates on the table as well. And so it sounds like maybe the two main parties will maybe decide to welcome Libertarians or work with them a little bit. And it sounds like they did reach out and express interest in talking in the future. So we'll see where that goes. But, you know, definitely a strong statement stance Libertarians have, and they're happy about that after the election.
Certainly. Yeah, now from a more politically savvy level, you can look at which way those voters may go, but from a retail voter's perspective, if they're looking at these vote totals, Teresa, and they see the Libertarian candidate has more than the difference between the Republican and the Democrat, and they preferred one or the other to be on top, they may have some opinions about whether or not they like the third parties. Do you think this changes anything as far as a basic voter's view of third-party candidates and how they affect races?
I think it's slowly changing, as we're seeing, and it does have a spoiler effect, if you will, as it's been mentioned. I think they are up and coming, and you never know down the line, but I think right now the two-party system is basically where it's safe for the candidates who decide to run on either side, Democrat or Republican. But don't count them out, right? We saw from Brianna's story and the election results. So it is a spoiler, and it's increasing, but for the moment I think the Republican Democrat is basically safe.
Yeah, I'm sure the Libertarians appreciate having more and more influence in some of these races, even if they're just being invited to the conversations.
And remember also that the Libertarians, because of the way the state law is spelled out, they have to get a certain percentage of the vote each time around to stay on the ballot and not have to go through that whole crazy process of getting back on the ballot. So they enjoy that spoiler role, and probably enjoy even more the fact that they don't have to go back and get a bunch of petitions again to get back on the ballot.
Exactly, exactly. And so when it comes to the two major parties, we've got a lot of fighting, and it looks like that we have some political divisions and some controversy that popped up with FEMA maybe treating different parties in different ways. There's controversy there with FEMA director, I believe, that mentioned Western North Carolina. Can you tell us more about this story you've got on CarolinaJournal.com?
Sure. So this all started last week. Actually, Daily Wire broke the story about a worker in Florida named Marnie Washington, who was accused of directing her volunteers to avoid houses in Florida who had President Trump's campaign signs after Hurricane Milton, struck. They were told to avoid those, and people who went and volunteered says, we don't think this is right. Regardless of what party, people are the most vulnerable right now. You can't even imagine going through a hurricane and then having someone avoid your house because of what political party you're maybe possibly voting for. So there were some whistleblowers that told on her. She did get let go, got fired. The FEMA administrator last Saturday, Dan Criswell, said that it's unacceptable. They're not going to tolerate that type of behavior. So this Marnie Washington went on a podcast on YouTube and also talked to Daily Mail and said not only did it happen in Florida, this is a directive that's come down from FEMA, and it's also gone on in Western North Carolina. And we were told mid-October, Governor Cooper always had these updates, updating what's going on with Hurricane Helene relief recovery efforts, that there's no misinformation, and there is misinformation. It's got to stop. Quit doing this. Deanne Criswell said the same thing. People were all pointing out, but it's not. It is happening, and apparently it is happening, and especially if she's saying it. So right now, next week, there is going to be a hearing. Did another story. It's the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure. One of their subcommittees is having a hearing in Washington with Deanne Criswell testifying, along with Representative Chuck Edwards, who covers most of his district covers most of Western North Carolina, and also Deborah Ross is going to be testifying. Interesting comment. I did call a few different people to get their reaction to this story about Western North Carolina, and Congressman Edwards' communications director said, it's an internal issue with FEMA, and redirected me to FEMA. It's like kind of kicking the can down the road. It's like, but it's not internal. These people who are suffering have suffered. There's more things coming out about small businesses not getting loans from the federal government, and they're struggling. Tourism is taking like a 90% hit in Western North Carolina. There's so much going on. Cajun Navy has also filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get more information, because they said, now this is correct, people are not getting the help from the federal government. There's just so many more layers going on, and hopefully we will hear something next week in Washington. And also I did reach out to Governor Cooper's office and FEMA. They did not get back to me. But regardless of what political party, it doesn't matter. We're all human beings. We all have needs, and someone in their most vulnerable time needs that help. So if this is true, and it's looking like it is, It's just a horrible story.
Yeah, and it adds to the pile of different kind of battling narratives about FEMA and the response after
Yes.
Hurricane Helene. And so when it comes to those kind of the misinformation that Cooper talked to, Brianna, when you have confirmation that something like this is happening, at least initially it looks like that it was, what does that do to that world of what Cooper called misinformation, and what admittedly lots and lots of wacky conspiracy theories out there about Western North Carolina in the aftermath of that Helene, but what does this do to that kind of whole universe of narratives on this subject?
Yeah, it was hard as the hurricane hit and happened. Everybody was trying to understand what was happening out there in Western North Carolina, and there was a lot of, like you said, conspiracies or different information floating around. And FEMA was one of the things, and they were, if you recall, trying to refute the allegations and say, no, we're on the ground, we're
Right.
helping. And so, you want to trust the federal agency is doing what their job is supposed to be doing, help a community that's in turmoil. But it sounds like maybe FEMA is in turmoil internally. But I did hear down in Florida, the Attorney General down there is actually taking action to look into this for Florida residents. So it remains to be seen if North Carolina's Attorney General would do the same. Not so sure about that, but at least Florida, the state, is taking action to address the federal government and what happened with FEMA and the political bias that might be happening within the agency.
One thing I wanted to add to really quickly, I was at President Trump's rally in Raleigh last Monday, or 2 Mondays ago. I did speak to someone who was there from Lake Lure, and she said, absolutely, we did not see FEMA for 3 weeks. And when they did set up their office, it's in Durham. She says, so people are having enough time having trouble getting down their street. They're going to come to Durham for help. She said that President Trump was there more on the ground, more so than the Biden-Harris administration, helping out. But she said FEMA was most definitely not there for at least 3 weeks. So, and that's someone who was actually there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Mitch, when we talk about these things with the disaster relief efforts and the legislation that comes afterward, sometimes in this day and age, our news cycle goes so quickly that we tend to kind of move on, and we don't want to forget about those things. Do you think that kind of drip stories like this, where FEMA's back in the news about treatment in Western North Carolina, may help keep the focus on Western North Carolina as we move forward legislatively and otherwise?
Yeah, the focus needs to be on Western North Carolina, so if there's one positive of the bad news of FEMA, that might be it, that it helps keep the story in the headlines. The other thing that struck me about this is that the last time Carolina Journal did a poll, and you can find those polls at carolinajournal.com, questions on that poll asked about people's sense of the state's ability to respond to emergency and their assessment of FEMA, and you did find the stark partisan split. It was basically Democrats thought the state government and FEMA were doing a good job. Republicans said no. I think half of Republicans who were surveyed thought they didn't think the state was doing a decent job at all in dealing with the emergencies, and had a very negative opinion of FEMA. None of this that Teresa's been reporting on is going to help with that. No. It's certainly going to make this, if not worse, at least not make the partisan divide any better.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, moving on to our next story. That's another Teresa article that we have on Josh Dobson, who's the former Commissioner of Labor in North Carolina, just as of last week. So he resigned following the election. He was not on the ballot. He was going to have this be his last term. Can you tell us about what he is up to next?
Yeah, we were all wondering last week. It's like after the day after election, it's like, oh, he resigned, and it's like, okay, where did he go? Well, we found out this week. He is now heading up the North Carolina Healthcare Association after about 21 years in public service. He was also, in addition to being labor commissioner, he was a county commissioner. He served on the state legislature as a representative. So he is supposed to be bridging a gap, bringing more more of the community together with hospitals, seeing what their true needs are. And everything. The Healthcare Association represents over 100 different hospitals or medical facilities in the state. So it's a pretty big role. I know Governor Cooper appointed somebody last week for the role. His name escapes me at the moment. But yeah, he announced, Josh Dobson announced back in December of 2022 that he was not going to be running. So that announcement was like, he made that announcement a long time ago. But it was a little bit of a shock last week to see, oh, he stepped down. He's only got a couple months left, but now we know why, so going into the private sector. And he's had, some I think he sits on one of their boards too, so he's got some experience with that as well.
Yeah, of course, the North Carolina Healthcare Association is previously the North Carolina Hospital Association, I believe, and so they are advocating for the hospitals and lots of legislation across North Carolina, kind of instrumental in the fight over the Certificate of Need regulations and efforts to repeal that. They usually fight against those efforts. What do you make of this move for Dobson? Mitch had a long resume of service here, starting in McDowell County, was a legislator. I remember him pushing some medical field related things in the legislature with expanding the scope of practice for nurse practitioners, things like that.
Which he won't be talking about now.
He won't be talking about that now. Yeah, but with that kind of varied experience, what do you think that he brings to the table in this new role, and in which we will probably see at least his fingerprints on different legislation moving forward?
Yeah, it's very interesting because the Healthcare Association is basically the lobbying arm for the hospitals. They do some other things, but that's their main thing. The hospitals want certain goals out of the General Assembly. The Healthcare Association is the way they approach that. And having a former legislator now being the main person talking to the legislature certainly is going to be helpful in some fronts. I think one of the interesting pieces of this, though, is that Dobson, as Teresa mentioned, was a member of the House before he became Labor Commissioner. The Healthcare Association has seemed to have much of its problem with the Senate. The Senate leadership has been the one that's been pushing for potentially getting rid of Certificate of Need, potentially taking other steps that would make the Hospital Association not as happy as they'd like to be. And so it'll be interesting to see whether Josh Dobson, as a former House member, is able to penetrate any of those concerns from the Senate, or if they just say, oh, this was the House guy, you know, we know where he stands, and they still stand against the hospitals. I think it'll be very interesting, but it also does give us the aha of why Josh Dobson would quit with just a couple months left. He's decided, I don't want to wait till January to cash in, I'm going to do it now.
Yeah, usually when you get these kind of announcements, that it just brings the question mark immediately, and then a couple days later, your curiosity is satisfied, and a lot of time they're going to spend more time with family and then maybe enter a lobbying career, and more time with family and then maybe entering a consulting career. So this move, this answers that question at least. And it also cleared the field, Brianna, when Dobson decided not to run for Luke Farley, or to have an open race for this Labor Commissioner seat. Luke Farley, one of the younger members of the Council of State in his election. What do you make of just kind of pivoting towards the Farley administration? I believe you mentioned that they had been in talks, and the Dobson replacement will be in talks with Farley as he's moving his transition into the thing. What do you think about Farley coming into this role and what that's going to mean for North Carolina?
Yeah, they were really happy, his team, with the win that they pulled off in North Carolina's election. I know they're looking forward to transitioning and getting him in. And I think it's interesting to look at all the Council of States races. 5 went to Republicans and 5 went to Democrats. So talking with some people that were, leading these campaigns, it's interesting to see that all of the candidates that won on both sides of the aisle were a little less controversial, and were a little calmer, didn't make the headlines as much, and didn't have major stories going out about them. And so talking with people connected to Luke Farley, it sounds like that was kind of important to their race as well, and just making sure he was sticking to his points and not trying to connect with any of the other controversial Republicans or anything like that. So made a significant impact, I think.
Yeah, and his opponent was actually controversial, Braxton Winston.
Yeah.
He was in the riots in 2020. He had a lot of different controversial, viewpoints.
An activist in Charlotte, leading the social justice kind of protests and everything there.
Yeah, so I don't think that helped. Plus, Luke's got a background in some of the labor law and that nature. So when you take a look at the two candidates, I think people decided maybe, obviously, he was a better fit for the position too.
Yeah.
And you said you won a more like calm candidate, if you will, a very a sturdy, trustworthy candidate. So.
Yeah.
And an interesting piece of that is after he won the primary, and the sort of the anointed candidate in that primary was State Representative John Hardister, and Luke Farley kind of won an upset victory. There was a scathing report by the Chamber
Yep.
talking about Luke Farley and I think Michelle Morrow
Yes.
as nominees and saying, oh, these people are going to be terrible, outside of the realm of acceptable possibilities. And then they kind of backed off on saying that about Luke Farley after a while once they realized, oh no, this is a guy who actually has been in this field as a lawyer in this exact field that's covered by the Labor Department. To me, the most interesting thing about Luke Farley entering office now and taking on this new role is, you'll appreciate this, he's got young kids. He had a kid while campaigning.
Right.
So probably one of the biggest saints in all of this is going to be Mrs. Farley, because she's going to have a lot of duties while he's taking on this new duty.
Yes, exactly.
And he's got the endorsement of Sherry Berry. Right?
Yeah, so that helped him a lot in the race. The North Carolina's own elevator queen was endorsing Farley in that race and helped him with that win. And as you mentioned, he was an OSHA attorney, so he's got experience in the courtroom. And when it comes to the courtroom, we've got a couple of more cases of interest here. One on a very notable name a few years ago in Republican politics, and then another case involving animal cruelty charges that is taking the attention of some of the bigger industry groups here in the state. So you can tell us about those cases.
Sure, I'll start with the first one. Mark Meadows, who was a longtime congressman out in the West. You mentioned Chuck Edwards. Chuck Edwards has the seat that at one time was Mark Meadows' seat. In between the two, speaking of controversy, Madison Cawthorn, whose name we haven't heard for a while. But Mark Meadows was a congressman, and then near the end of the first Trump term, I believe it was in March of 2020, Meadows became chief of staff to Donald Trump. After the election, when Joe Biden beat Donald Trump, but the Trump team was not convinced of it and was trying to find ways to stay in office, Mark Meadows got involved in those efforts. As part of his effort there, the folks in Fulton County, Georgia, charged Trump, Meadows, and others with election interference. And so the court case that got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court was Mark Meadows trying to have that case moved out of Georgia state courts and into federal court. A federal trial judge said no. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said no. And the U.S. Supreme Court just this week said we're not taking the case. So the case against Mark Meadows is going to proceed in state court. And the main argument against Meadows, who has had a plausible argument that, look, you want to protect federal officials from being prosecuted in state courts because some antagonistic state court that doesn't like what the federal government is doing could charge some federal official with a crime, and you don't want that to happen.
Some may think that's a good thing.
Right, that's a good thing. But what the lower level courts said, and the Supreme Court didn't say anything, they just announced they weren't going to take the case. But the lower courts have said, look, what you were doing doesn't really have anything to do with your job as chief of staff. It was part of the Trump campaign. And so you can't say this is part of your official duties and try to have the case removed in that way. It'll be interesting to see whether that has any long-term impacts, because there could be some other cases in the future where someone acting in their official role does something that also benefits a campaign, and does that end up leading to the possibility that the person could be charged in a state court proceeding. So that was one. The other thing that you mentioned was there's an animal cruelty case that a group called Legal Impact for Chickens, or LIC, this is an animal welfare group, they filed suit last year against an operation called Case Farms that has a number of different operations in North Carolina, including Morganton, which is where the suit was filed. And basically the argument is, even though businesses that are involved in producing food for humans or animals are typically exempt from animal cruelty laws, I mean, they're killing animals, that's part of the process. Yeah. Even though that they are exempt from the animal cruelty laws, they aren't completely exempt. If they do things that are intentionally killing the animals that they're not producing for feed, that could open them up to legal liability. That the case was dismissed by a trial judge, but now LIC, Legal Impact for Chickens, has appealed that case to the State Court of Appeals. And the interesting development this week was that the North Carolina Farm Bureau Federation, the North Carolina Poultry Federation, North Carolina Pork Council, which doesn't have anything to do with chickens, but they all filed briefs in the appeals court saying, look, appeals court, let us file friend of the court briefs in this case, you want to really come up with a good ruling on this, because if you take legal impact for chickens interpretation of the state law, you're going to upend the entire poultry industry, because they'll have to deal with all of this crazy litigation that's coming about. They'll have, if LIC ends up winning and others win, that will completely change the way these poultry operations will have to move forward. They'll have to take other steps to make sure that the chickens that don't get slaughtered don't get killed in other ways before they get slaughtered.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be interesting to see how that case plays out. Some big guns.
Yeah, these are big industries
yeah,
in North Carolina. I believe there are one or two in both poultry and pork, and so these are not small kind of representative groups like coming to file friend of the court briefs here.
That's right, and I should point out that the LIC also had some briefs on its behalf from some veterinarians and some other groups, but not the group that represents all farms in North Carolina and the industry groups for the poultry and pork industries. Those folks are kind of heavy hitters in North Carolina politics and really will attract attention from the legislators who are interested in ag issues. So them jumping into this case shows that they think it's more than just, forget about it, they're not going to win. They really do have a concern about legal impact for chickens getting a ruling that would favor its interpretation of the state's animal cruelty laws.
Yeah. So in 2024, these kind of battles actually kind of have a line that cuts through some kind of cultural and political narratives that are going on, especially with kind of the agricultural industry. We did the Sowing Resilience documentary to focus on how our food gets from the farms to the tables and everything in between. But there's a big push for maybe some alternative practices and stuff in agriculture, things like that. What do you make of this case and how it may affect kind of different sentiments going on in North Carolina when it comes to kind of big food and how consumers are really getting their products to them?
I mean, probably better practices, like you can go to the store now and buy cage-free eggs, or, maybe things that aren't, animals that aren't like in the stalls, or more humane treatment. I don't think it's going to end the practice. Obviously, a lot of people like to eat meat, pork and chicken and all of that, but maybe looking at different ways to maybe be a little more humane in terms of that. I'm seeing something like that. I think is a possibility.
Yeah, it seems to give some wind at the back of some of the pushes for the sustainable agriculture. Right. We talked to some farmers that were into the sustainable practices as far as farming and getting not just better treatment of the animals, but a better product overall. So do you think that may be a silver lining in some of this pressure against the poultry industry and pork industry taking interest too, and maybe pushing things a little bit more in that direction where consumers are happy and the businesses can remain profitable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the years ahead we're going to see a lot of changes when it comes to agriculture and our food and health and how our food is processed and what's allowed to be put into our foods, even like artificial ingredients, because at the federal level it sounds like things could be changing in like DHHS or just different, like the FDA, for example, with RFK coming in potentially to a top position. So I think here in North Carolina and then across the country we could see some big shakeups when it comes to the health that we're getting and the quality of our food, and just the laws and how this stuff is manufactured and the food that we get on our tables.
Yeah.
And I didn't get into it, but probably it's worth noting that the claims that are made in this lawsuit are very eye-opening when you look at them, because we all know that a chicken plant, what they're going to do is slaughter these chickens for people to eat. But the claims in there are that outside of that process, other chicks that are hatched and then later grow and then are slaughtered, during that whole process, there are things like them starving to death or being overheated, or as they're being transported, intentionally running over these chicks. And so that's part of what the animal welfare group is saying is, look, we know you're going to slaughter a lot of these chickens. That's part of your business. You do have an exemption from state animal cruelty law to do that. But why are you intentionally killing these other chickens in other ways that aren't part of that process? And I think what the the Farm Bureau and the Pork Council and the Poultry Federation are saying is, look, our exemption covers the entire process. You can't come in and say it's okay to slaughter the chickens, but you've got to, between the time they're born and then do these other things. The exemption covers everything. The lawsuit is saying, no, you can't go out of your way to be cruel to the animals that don't end up on someone's table.
Yeah, and these are not just like a small mom and pop farm operation, but in North Carolina in particular, we have some huge installations. I believe in Siler City, there's a hatchery that I think they're hatching like 300,000 chicks a day.
Wow.
So these are big operations. So with the scale of that, you can understand how there's a lot of different moving parts. And so you can see why the industries want to protect the whole process, and you can see why the advocates would want to point to certain parts of it that may be modified to have a more humane treatment of chickens. So looking out for the chickens. So that's it for us today on the debrief, but next week we're going to have a whole lot of legislative news because the North Carolina legislature, the General Assembly, is coming back. They are facing not having a supermajority when they come back in January of 2025, the Republicans that is. So there may be more action. Check in with us at the debrief next week to get your latest legislative updates. And as always, check out all of the articles on carolinajournal.com, and we will see you next week.